All right, so we are going to go live, and today's reading is going to be about PTSD, the diagnostic criteria from DSM-5, which is current as of 2013. So I like to think of the people who wrote this as the white men of the Church of Supremacy, Church of Psychiatry. And why is that? Because of the way that they talk about us, without us, the way that they conduct themselves in the prejudicial content. So what I would like to do is first refer to page 271. And page 271 is where we have the diagnostic criteria, and the code that the doctor will use to bill your insurance is 309.81. So if they're diagnosing you with PTSD, you have this code now in your insurance records, 309.81, and then that's the ICD code for international diagnosis and people who need a ICD code for other reasons besides for just a diagnostic code. So, well, let's look at what they first ask. They're asking that in order to meet the criteria, you have to meet criteria A, B, C, D, and E, and then F and G is talking about the frequency, severity, H. Okay, so there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. We're looking at 8 different criteria that you must meet in order to gain a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic is one word, so PTSD really is an acronym of a word that is merged. Okay, so the first thing they're telling you is to make a note that the criteria applies to adults, adolescents, and children older than 6. So children who are 6 and younger, you have to look at the corresponding criteria below. So every time they're talking about it, they're also talking about different ways that people are looking at it, for children. So children will have more ways to have to prove to the diagnostician that they're legitimate, and we don't provide ways for clinicians to observe that. So, hey, you have to jump over this hoop to talk to somebody about your PTSD, while adults only have to jump through this hoop. Veterans from war only have to jump through this hoop. All right, starting with criteria A. This is the first criteria, which is going to be the topic of my research paper that I've co-authored with Secret, and it's going to hopefully be published this month or next month. So the first criteria pertains to exposure. Have you been exposed to something that was potentially traumatizing? Have you been exposed to anything that you have perceived as harmful? And if so, how can we evaluate if you've been exposed to something? What if you're nonverbal and you don't talk about it? What if you're not typing? What if you're having traumatizing memories, flashbacks? It's hard to remember the details because you're completely traumatized. You don't want to go into the topic. Well, you have to prove exposure. All right, so I'm just checking that I can see it. I have no restrictions on your comments. I have anyone who's commenting. I mean, I don't know how to see this. Facebook's doing some weird stuff, so I can't really tell what your comments are. I'm going to try to load it on a different screen at the same time so I can see what's going on the other end too. All right, so it says that I am now live. I can watch live.
All right,
and turn off the sound. Okay, good. All right, so Tanya says yo, and Julianne says, okay, we're watching, so let's watch. All right, criterion A. Exposure to actual or threatened death. So we're describing the events that are considered potentially traumatizing. Actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence. These are 3 kinds of exposures that are considered traumatizing, and they're used as an example. And then there are 4 ways that you could have experienced it. This should be number 4. 4 ways that you can experience it. You can have direct experience, where you're, number 1, directly experiencing the traumatic event, or parenthesis events with a letter S. So that means that plural, you can have multiple events that you've directly experienced. Number 2, Witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others. Oh my gosh, the next door neighbor's child got run over. I'm potentially traumatized because I saw the car accident. You witnessed in person the event as it occurred to others. 3, you learned about the traumatic event that occurred to a close family member or close friend. I just found out a friend of mine died on the operating table, okay? And I heard about it from someone. So learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend. Remember, the trauma isn't learning about it. The trauma is that you're exposed to the traumatizing situation, which is somebody dying. And then there's a little sub-sentence there. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental. So learning about it meets the criteria. And when there is actual or threatened death, it must have been violent or accidental. Difference between learning as opposed to the actual occurrence. Okay, 4, experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. For example, first responders collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to details of child abuse. So there is a note here that experiencing repeated or extreme exposure, the note says that A4, A criterion exposure 4 under A, is it does not apply to exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures unless this exposure is work-related. So if you watched the, Twin Towers fall down on 9/11 and you watched it on television, it's a little tricky because it's not considered that you're exposed to an aversive detail on electronic media such as television. However, if you have learned about this traumatic event that happened to somebody where actual death has occurred, you're meeting the criteria. So there's a little loophole there. You're watching, you're on Reddit and somebody's threatening to take their life and they actually go through with it on live event. Are you witnessing it? Yes. Are you seeing death, violence right in front of you? Yes. With, electronic media, we can argue that, and we are going to win this one. All right, we have more people watching. Thank you. So now we finished how to categorize exposure. Now I want to talk about criteria B, which is the presence of intrusion. So what are symptoms of intrusion? Now we're looking at the emotional ways to test. So the first criteria just evaluates whether you've met the criteria to continue testing. Once we know you've been exposed because you've met one of the criteria types, then we can move on to the rest and evaluate the impact on your daily life. So now we're starting on the emotional response. So criterion B is that there has to be the presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms. Tanya is asking, so if something is traumatizing to you, but not usually traumatizing to normal people, it wouldn't count, ? Well, like in the example provided is, my friend's apartment was tidied up by her mother, who then stole and threw away some of her stuff, and 2 years later she still feels violated and panicky. But this wouldn't count because the book, the Bible, says it's not sexual or violent. So in this particular case, if the encounter or the exposure that happened is that your friend had her mother come into her personal space, private space, or even her room in the house where everyone else lives, or even mom, and then mom made some decisions to throw things away. What you're describing is the event that for a normal person wouldn't be traumatizing, but for your friend, it was perceived as a traumatizing or aversive experience. So let's look back at the language and where can we find it in the actual Bible on page 271. Okay, so she is directly experiencing a traumatic event? Fine. Did she witness it in person as it occurred to others? No, because it occurred to her. So now let's look at how the idea is that it has to be the exposure of the type, okay? So actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Now, we are going to make the argument that it is serious injury for autistic people to experience identity threat, being told that they have to do things differently in a normal way, stop stimming, and all of that. So yes, Krista, thank you. It covers PTSD from emotional abuse. Absolutely. So if emotional abuse feels like a death threat to you, if emotional abuse compromises your feelings of safety and security, you have been exposed to a traumatizing adverse experience. Now let's look at how it manifests in our daily life, okay? Criterion B, keep the questions coming. So the intrusion symptoms that we have, okay? Mom comes in, cleans your room, throws away things that she thinks normal people don't need to have in their house. Emotional abuse. Why do you have to be different? Why can't you be more like your sister, right? Story of my life. So that is emotional abuse. Why? Because to me, it was emotionally traumatizing. So we're looking at criterion B, the presence of one or more. So there's a list of 5 different symptoms of intrusion, and you just need to meet one of any 5. So pick one and you got them. All right. I mean, you'll meet the criteria for B. So assuming you've been exposed, criterion A, you know all the exposure types, we're looking at for intrusion associated, this is key. The intrusion symptom has to be associated with the traumatic event. So you can't be emotionally traumatized because your mom threw your things away and then have intrusion symptoms that happen in the ice cream store because someone cut in line. Okay? So the feelings of intrusion and all that has to happen in association with the actual traumatic event. So 1 of 5. Recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic event. 3 different things in one sentence. There's memories of the traumatic event that is distressing, and it intrudes because you can't function because you're having recurrent and involuntary distressing memories that are intrusive. Therefore, B1 is the recurrent, involuntary, and intrusive distressing memories of the event. Every time I go into my room and I have a new plushie and I put it on the shelf, I might be concerned that mom will come and throw it out. So when I put the plushie in my room, I will hide it in the top drawer. Okay? And then the note about children under 6. We're not going to talk about children until the end. We're going to come back and look at how this is different for children, which I said was the bar is so high for children, it's really unfair. It means that children don't get diagnosed with PTSD because they just made the threshold be impossible. And it does not consider non-speaking people. Okay, so B2, another type of intrusion symptom is number 2, recurrent distressing dreams in which the content or affect of the dream are related to the traumatic event. So the content related to the traumatic event, I had a dream that I was going to a meetup with my other autistic friends and we did puzzles all night. And then I got to keep the puzzle of the gummy bears, so I now have a 5,000 puzzle piece done, and we glued it, and it's ready to come home. I bring it home, and I put it away because I don't want mom to, find it because she might think it's too weird. And then I have a dream that your mom took the puzzle apart, and she put it on T-shirts all over for fundraising for you because you're a puzzle, right? Okay, so having some kind of dream that is distressing to you and that it pertains to the content of the actual traumatic event. So it can be that abstract. If the dream is mom stole your special interest, your favorite item, and then she turned it into something humiliating like that, it never even happened, but it was a dream. Therefore, it's meeting the intrusion symptom. It intrudes in your dreams. Can you imagine how deeply the traumatizing event is rooted in your mind? All right, 3, Another intrusion, 3 of 5. Dissociative reactions, for example, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were recurring. Such reactions may occur on a continuum, with the most extreme expression being a complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. Okay, we have a continuum. A person is having a dissociative reaction, sometimes a mild flashback, they're moving on. It's still an intrusion. It can be an extreme intrusion where the flashback leads to, oh my God, I have no idea where I am. I'm only in the experience in my mind because the flashback intruded to a severe level. Complete loss of awareness of present surroundings. In that flashback, you can either feel or act as if the traumatic event is happening again. So how does it feel when it's happening again? It feels as violating as it felt at the first time. How do you act when you're feeling like it's recurring? You're acting in the same way that a person who just encountered the traumatic event. If your friend reacted with feeling violated and panicky, that means she's living with ongoing intrusive symptoms. Yeah, I brought some toys to cheer myself up because every time I want to rain on the parade, I brought my rain stick. There we go, raining on the parade of psychiatry. All right, criterion C, we're looking for persistent avoidance. Avoidance. We covered intrusion, now we're talking about avoidance, okay? Avoidance, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the traumatic event, beginning after the traumatic event occurred, and has to be evidenced by one of the following. So not only do you, if you meet criteria C where you have persistent avoidance of stimuli related, so let's say a child goes to speech therapy, and in speech therapy they're being forced to say apple, say apple, say apple, no iPad time, say apple, say apple. Okay, so this is constant, right? This is speech therapy. If they're going to persistently avoid, the kid might just have to be dragged to speech therapy. If you have to drag your child to something, they're physically trying to avoid desperately. Kids who don't want to go to school in the morning, my stomach hurts. Kids who will scream, kids who will bite you if you don't stop dragging them to something that is aversive to them. Okay, so persistent avoidance of any stimuli, anything at all. This is something that we are looking at. It has to meet one or both of the following types of avoidances. Either the avoidance or efforts to avoid, avoidance of, yes, there you go, avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event. So if you're making efforts to avoid a distressing memory or a distressing thought or a distressing feeling or anything closely, literally closely associated with the traumatic event. I don't want to go back in my room anymore because it's been violated by my mom. She threw away my stuff. Number 2, avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders, such as people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about, or closely associated with a traumatic event. So what is something that we can think of? So back to Tanya's example. Mom comes into this grown woman's room and throws away stuff under the impression of, hey, I'm mom, I'm cleaning your room, and we're going to normalize you, right? So what are some avoidance efforts she can make about external reminders? We know about distressing memories that she can avoid, but external reminders of any category, people, place, conversation, activities, objects, situations. She's on social media and she sees a conversation about another autistic person who had the same thing happen to them. Or she or she's referred by her therapist for a social skills group where the first social skills training is, today we're going to learn how to keep a tidy room. Yeah, that's an activity. That's just not appropriate. A situation. What can be a situation? The family's going away to the lake house, and you're all at the lake house, and the situation is such that you don't get to have the room that you always had all the years because now you're being told that since you're 18 already, you have to be in charge of making your own bed, and that's just a situation that can remind you, be an external reminder of all the threats that has happened to you in the past. So for C, we have 1 or 2, but you don't have to meet C. You can meet B, you can meet D. So let's go on to D. D is a negative. This is really important because autistic people have this as their baseline on a daily basis, but here it is in the diagnostics for PTSD, and we just like, where do you go from there? So I have my my nope, not today bell, and if I'm just feeling really assaulted by this, I'm just going to hit the nope. All right, so PTSD, page 271, all the way on the bottom, the diagnostic criteria includes D. D is a negative alteration in cognitions, negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with a traumatic event, beginning or worsening after the event occurred, and it has to be evidenced by 2 or more. So 2 or more of a list of 7, okay? So if you meet the criteria D, it has to be 2 of the 7 in this list. So we'll go down the list of negative alterations in cognition and mood. Now, who wants to give me an example of a negative alteration in cognition and mood? Or even an alteration. What is an alteration in mood? What is an alteration in cognition? What does it mean? So like, I'm smart, I go to school one day, and then tomorrow I'm not smart. Is that how it works, right? Like, describe negative alteration in mood and cognition. Well, let's see what the white man of the Church of Psychiatry has said. There you go. That's me being angry and being appropriate about it. Okay, so 7. Let's go down the list of 1 through 7. Number 1, inability to remember, can't remember, an important aspect of the traumatic event, typically due to dissociative amnesia and not to other factors such as a head injury, alcohol, or drugs. So that's right. Now Jenny said dissociation. That's literally taking out of criterion D 1. The first classic sign is dissociation. We're not dissociated because we're walking around and we don't know that it's Monday or Friday. We're not dissociated when we're walking around in the street and we are stepping on the sidewalk halfway and half in the 1 foot in the road, just like Pippi Longstocking. That's not dissociation. Dissociation is when you literally can't remember important parts of the story. So if I'm asking you, hey, Tanya, what happened to your friend? And your friend is like, can't talk about it, and the details don't add up, what does that look like for somebody who needs an evaluation, who needs an assessment, who needs to be diagnosed, can't recall the critical memories? So, but yes, you have to recall the memories in order to demonstrate exposure, but at the same time, if you remember everything, then you don't need D1. However, maybe you can meet D2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. Okay, so page 272, it's the second page of the PTSD diagnostic criteria, the DSM-5. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, others, or the world. For example, I am bad. No one can be trusted. The world is completely dangerous. My whole nervous system is permanently ruined. What are some of these negative alterations in cognition that you have witnessed in autistic adults who are socializing on Facebook, right? They're with you, we're having social communication, however they take place. And what are some statements you have seen? From my experience, I've seen never trust a therapist because they're not diversity trained, or all moms are stupid, right? All moms are hero autism moms, or all ABA all ABA is ABA or something like that. We've seen those. These are cognitive distortions. These are statements of everybody versus nobody, but it is exaggerated. It's persistent and it's exaggerated. Persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about yourself, others, or the world. So, I'm an alien. My parents are monsters. My teachers should be shot. I've seen these things being discussed. Okay, we're looking at D3, the negative alterations in mood and cognition. We're halfway through the list pretty much. So 3 is persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the traumatic, persistent negative emotional state. So again, persistent, distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences of the event, the negative event obviously, that leads the individual to blame himself or herself or others. And I misread because I tracked the next line. So again, persistent, distorted cognition about the cause or consequences of the event, which then leads the individual to blame themselves or to blame others. So if I have a persistent and distorted cognition, which is anything pertaining to intellect, the cortex, my brain has a persistent and distorted idea about the cause or consequence of the event. So the first thing that comes to mind is Tanya's example. And please, if you're watching, post examples of things that you're not entirely sure are maybe traumatizing or not, okay? I have a persistent traumatizing exposure to the people who deliver my mail, and it says no flyers, no junk, do not disturb, no solicitation. I filled out the form twice with the post office, yet they keep putting stuff in my mailbox, and I don't need to know that the tenant who lived here before was, affiliated with this organization, with that organization, that it's time for their mammogram. I don't need to know that stuff. I don't need to know anything other than what I need to know. Don't use my mailbox to take my time, because now I have to process your paperwork. So that to me is a persistent and distorted cognition about the cause or consequence of that. Meaning, for me, there's the negative consequence is that I am blaming myself. How am I blaming myself? Because I told myself, no, surely you have to fill out some form with the post office to let them know that you're not interested in unsolicited mail. Turns out you just don't have to get that stuff, and nobody's explained to me how I can eliminate this from myself, so it just keeps coming in my mailbox. So anything that leads you to blame yourself when something traumatizing has occurred, it isn't your fault. You were not asking for it. This is the part where we definitely confirm for anyone diagnosed with PTSD that you were not asking for it, okay? Yes, you can walk around without an underpants, and no, you're not to blame if you were violated because of it. All right, so 4 out of 7, persistent negative emotional state. And I'm sorry this PTSD reading is not as funny. If you want to make jokes, let's work with that, because we should be making fun of this, but we're going to get to the part where they talk about the diagnostic features in full length. Remember the essay dump that they put after the criteria? Risk and prognosis factors, differential diagnosis, culture-related diagnosis, gender, suicide risk, and then the other reasons why people are more vulnerable or more susceptible. Hint, hint. Developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, we will get to it. People with physical disabilities. Okay, so we're getting into the end of D1 of 7. We're moving along. Finally, we'll just finish with persistent negative emotional state, such as fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. If you're perpetually feeling fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame, and it's not even related to the event, you're having cognition, you're having alterations in mood, you're having alterations in cognition, okay? Because guilt, you're blaming. Why are you blaming yourself? That's not necessary. That's not part of the daily life. We don't persistently blame ourselves. We don't persistently feel guilt, right? So Talia says, Funny how people also assign distortions when they don't want to acknowledge systemic abuse. Yes, they're telling us that we have cognitive distortions when we say, oh, ABA is abuse. What we're really doing is we're making these statements based on research. And you can make those statements, and if you don't justify it, you're showing signs of a cognitive distortion. But if you are bringing the research, then the person who's reacting and saying you are being cognitively distorted about this fact, then of course they're the ones who are pretty much dissociated, or maybe they've been assaulted by the fact because now they're experiencing what? Guilt, shame, horror, anger, fear of everything they have put their clients through or their child through. One of the hardest things I have to go through day after day when I consult with families for services is once they learn that the goal of the session between me and the child is to create a space for the child to demonstrate extreme giftedness, literacy opportunities, then they start crying because they immediately feel like everything they've done up until that moment caused harm to their child. We talk about it and we move through it because there's, guilt serves a purpose, but we don't want to guilt anybody into doing something right with their child. We want to discuss why we want to be grateful that we now are connected for opportunities. We always want to think about that in positive terms. So that's not a negative or persistent distortion. 5 out of 7, markedly diminished, and I'm sorry my accent, I have to pronounce it as markedly. I don't know how Americans do that. Markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. The child used to love watching SpongeBob. He starts ABA. They decide that SpongeBob is his special interest, and they're now using that special interest, finish the sentence, they're using his special interest as a motivator to get him to comply with the behaviorist's demand. So he comes home, and now he no longer wants to watch SpongeBob. Okay, that is classic intrusive, classic, not intrusion, persistent, classic negative alterations in cognition and mood under 5. Okay, D5 is any time you stop doing things that you were doing previously before the traumatic event, you meet the criteria. 6, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. Okay, we're looking at an adult who got a diagnosis 2 weeks ago, and they went to their first meetup, Autistic Pride or something like that, and they came home and suddenly they feel like they don't belong, neither here nor there. They're not welcome by their tribe. Something happened at that meetup. Somebody yelled at them for referring to their diagnosis as Asperger's. Somebody yelled at them for, someone shamed them for using functional labels they didn't know about, the politics. That is very traumatizing and violating to a person who doesn't know and is not intentionally trying to be, presented in that way. So that encounter is traumatizing, and if they are feeling detached or estranged from others, we can imagine, we can mark it down. They met the criteria. And lastly, 7 is the persistent inability to experience positive emotions. For example, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. Oh, he always used to hug me before he went to school, and now he comes home from school and he locks the door. He runs into his bedroom, and he won't even come to the dinner table, join the family. He's just not happy anymore. He just, I don't know, he doesn't want to do homework. He's completely disengaged. Doesn't want to do homework. That's a persistent avoidance of stimuli related to the event, right? Okay. We're done with D. We're moving into E. E, and we all know that arousal in this particular sense, when it comes to, the flood of chemicals in the brain, we know sexual arousal, we know is the pleasure centers, but we're talking specifically about arousal for, fight, flight, freeze. We're talking about reactivity, to a negative encounter. So what they're saying here in E is that you'll have to meet the criteria if there is marked alterations in arousal and reactivity associated with a traumatic event, beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, and as evidenced by E1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So first, let's look at all the different ways that E marked alteration in arousal and reactivity can be evaluated. One is irritable behavior and angry outbursts. And it specifically says with little or no provocation. Typical, did you guys have a typo here? It's typical with 2 L's. Whoa, my DSM-5 has a typo. What color flag am I putting? We're going with orange. I'm a nerd. Okay. Typically expressed. Okay, so E1 marked alteration in arousal and reactivity is irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression toward people or objects. You're having a great time. I'm teaching piano. Everyone's enjoying themselves. We just finished level 1. We moved into the next book. We're all really excited. Mom is taking her hand so she can point in the book where we're up to so the child can follow through the page. And guess what happens? She gets someone chomping down on her bones. There is no provocation. The mom should not say, "What the hell did I do wrong now?" That's not what happened. Little or no provocation of verbal or physical aggression toward people or objects. A child who will stomp on a box, who will break a toy, who will destroy the car seat. It's irritable behavior and angry outbursts, okay? With little or no provocation. Really important to know that. And why am I bringing this up? Announcement. Where's my shaker eggs? Oh, here we go. Okay. Yay! Let's mark this moment in time where we now know that violence and aggression, injury, self-harm is not autism. All the people who share online, "This is autism," picture of aggression, harm, screaming, running, that's not autism. That's PTSD. So this is why we're doing this reading. Aggression and violence is not autism. Side note from Talia that the PDF version has it correctly, the 2 L's. Yes, I do have 2 L's, but it seems to have no Y, typically. So I don't know what this is. Typical. Come on, where is this? I know I forgot to flip it on as backwards, but if I zoom in, I don't know if you can see it, but yeah, it says typical with 2 L's. I don't know what's going on. So moving into E2, reckless or self-destructive behavior, and I'm warning you, category E, criteria E, the marked alterations in arousal and reactivity is why we're doing this reading. We're doing this reading to vindicate all the people who have been told that they're severe autism or aggressive autism, regressive autism. All of those labels are illegitimate. It is all pertinent. It's part of the diagnostic criteria of the DSM-5 for PTSD. So I don't know, Talia, I don't know why the DSM printed version is weird. Maybe they're just pranking me, right? That's a cognitive distortion I'm having. All right. So E, irritable behavior and angry outbursts with little or no provocation was 1. 2, reckless or self-destructive behavior. We're not going to describe it. You've seen it. You know what it is. 3, hypervigilance. Hypervigilance, if an autistic person has hypervigilance, if an autistic person is very, showing signs that they're concerned because dad's about to pull up in the driveway, And that means something to them. It means that soon mom has to take me to therapy. It means that soon we will not be allowed to watch TV because when dad comes home, we have dinner. Any of that that relates to anything with the traumatic event, any kind of hypervigilance, being on alert for something that is about to occur. Okay, it's a way to prevent a re-traumatization from the flashback. So now we're looking at 4, which is exaggerated startle response. Hypervigilance and startle is 2 different things. Hypervigilance is preemptively being cautious, and startle response is an exaggerated response that is a little more than the person next to you. Okay, we're all going to the concert and this is the bell, right? Autistic people will have that. That's autism. We're responsive to sound. However, a child who starts having an exaggerated startle response after a traumatizing encounter, that is one of the criteria for alteration in arousal and reactivity. Duh. Okay. 5 is problems with concentration. Most people who come to me and say, I definitely need help with PTSD. My 2nd semester in college, I'm staring at the blank canvas. I can't write anything for school. It's like my brain doesn't work. I can't activate my thoughts and put it together. That is something that is an alteration in cognition. It is a reaction because of the arousal chemically. Chemically, you're having different alterations in arousal and reactivity in your brain. So if you're having all these intrusions and your brain is altered to the point where you can't concentrate, that is not ADHD. That is not a memory deficiency. It's not a learning disability. It's not autism. It's literally problems with concentration. It's one of the first ways that we know that there is PTSD. And a lot of the assessments for depression screenings is, are you having trouble concentrating? Because if you say yes, and then there are other things that you say yes to, then the requirement is take this person from the depression screening and now move them into the PTSD screening. The last one of E, alterations in arousal and reactivity, is sleep disturbance. Trouble sleeping. Autistic people are known to have really strange or different or abnormal sleeping patterns. Is it because we all have a sleep disorder? Is it because we are not producing melatonin? Is it because we're having nightmares? Is it because we have trouble falling asleep because we just physically can't put ourselves into the unconscious state where we are defenseless to be hypervigilant? We are defenseless from having a startle response? We're defenseless from re-traumatization? No, going to sleep is not an option. And in fact, in the example of sleep disturbance, it says difficulty falling or staying asleep or restless sleep. Any and all of the above is a sleep disturbance. We're moving into F, which is the duration of the disturbance. We're going back to look at criteria B, C, D, and E to make sure that criteria F specifies that the duration of all the previously mentioned disturbances have to have occurred for more than 1 month. So you can't just have a traumatizing encounter, be shocked, get over it, have all of these symptoms, and then you know what, 4 weeks later you're starting to recover and reintegrate and come back to yourself. Then you don't meet the criteria. The criteria is met if you found all of the previous, you met the threshold for all of the previous criteria and that it persisted for more than 1 month, which is 4 weeks. So G, the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social. Wow, Talia, you should come see this printed book version. I'm going to get my refund because social is SOC space AL, missing an I. Occupational has half a faded P. All right, stop perseverating, Henny. Focus! Okay, we're going back to G for the benefit of those who don't get nerdy jokes about editing and typos in professional groups. G is the disturbance. The disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Social functioning, occupational functioning, important areas of functioning. What is an important area of functioning? Tending to hygiene, tending to feeding oneself, tending to putting yourself to bed, waking yourself up, getting yourself on a routine, going to school, not going to school. Well, let's look at what is a clinically significant distress marker. It is an impairment of any of these functioning, social, occupational, or other important. So an impairment might be, I went for a job interview. I was struggling whether I should disclose I'm autistic or not. Then I took the gamble and I disclosed that I'm autistic. So then they asked if I'm going to need accommodations, and I said yes. I gave them my resume, which showed that I had 14 years of experience working at Pixar, and of course I'm overly qualified for the job, and they turned me down because they said they have people casually mentioned, well, we have people that can start work right away. So wait, your disclosure and your need for accommodation caused them to discriminate. So how would that impair significantly, causing you distress in a social or occupational area of functioning? You're not going to very likely go to another interview anytime soon. Or if you do go to another interview, how is it going to be impaired? Distressing because you now don't know if you should or shouldn't disclose. Boom. Finally, the last here, category H. It's the disturbance is not attributable to the physiological effects of substances or other medical conditions. So for example, medication or alcohol. If these disturbances are not because, hey, I was drunk and therefore I couldn't remember the details of my event. That's why people use substances, right? To numb themselves, to make them not be able to remember, to make them have alterations in sleep, such as sleep too much or stay awake. Caffeine is also a chemical, right? So anytime that there's another reason for this condition, we cannot definitively look at PTSD. We have to look at PTSD in its rawest form. We have to make sure that any physiological effects are not attributable to any other chemical reason or medical condition. And this is where we have sticky territory. So we're going to skip along the breakdown of children of 6 and under. We're just going to leave it by that as saying that there, every time we have to meet 2 or more or 1 or more of any criteria, they have to meet 5. And that's just cruel. Okay, we're going to skip diagnostic features. What we're going to look at is associative features that are of a supporting diagnosis. So developmental regression, such as loss of language in young children, may occur. Auditory pseudo-hallucinations, such as having the sensory experience of hearing one's thoughts spoken in 1 or more different voices, as well as paranoid ideation, can be present. Following prolonged, repeated, and severe traumatic events, such as childhood abuse, torture, and the individual may additionally experience difficulties in regulating emotions or maintaining stable and interpersonal relationships, or dissociative symptoms. When the traumatic event produces violent death, symptoms of both problematic bereavement and PTSD may be present. And they're talking about the prevalence. And I have a study here that shows that since 2013, the prevalence just is completely changing. Talia says it makes it difficult when people self-medicate with substances. Yes, if you're going to self-medicate and then hope that you get the diagnosis, you're creating a barrier for a diagnosis as well. Think about it, Talia, think about it in this way. A person who arrives to rehab completely knackered on their substances, right? Does that prevent treatment? Does it make rehab impossible? Yes, because we can't thoroughly evaluate them on their baseline. So the prevalence in the United States allegedly is a projected lifetime risk for PTSD using the older DSM-4 criteria is 8.7% of people who arrive to the ripe old age of 75 years old. So according to the older criteria before 2013, if you were 75 years old, 8% or almost 9% of people in their lifetime have met the criteria. The lower estimates are seen in Europe and most Asian, African, and Latin American countries, clustering around 0.5% or 1%. Hello, what do we know about prevalence of autism? We know that, middle class, upper class, mostly white people have the financial opportunity to earn their awesome diagnosis. What does it mean that in the United States we have the highest prevalence when compared to Europe? And like tenfold, right? We're looking at 9% as opposed to 0.5% everywhere else. Okay. Granted, the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, so they're looking at their own criteria and their own prevalences using their own metrics. So, Europe uses different metrics. It's pretty much informed by the DSM-5, but in Europe, we get to see some hazardous situations where people get to make up profiles of autism. We don't have profiles. You can't start creating a whole new handbook that hasn't been published in the United States, where pretty much the diagnostic codes and metrics have been established worldwide and adapted everywhere. So the highest rates, ranging from 1/3 to more than 1/2 of those exposed to a traumatic incident, are found among survivors of rape, military combat, and captivity, and ethnically or politically motivated internment and genocide. So half of the people who are, half of the people being held, right, by the government, because we have this big wall right now, half of those are definitely, there's a huge prevalence over there. And then there is here, the prevalence of PTSD may vary across development, children, and adolescents, including preschool children, who generally have displayed lower prevalence following exposure to serious traumatic events. However, this may be because previous criteria were insufficiently developmentally informed. They're claiming that the 2013 version of the diagnostic criteria is more developmentally informed. The prevalence of full threshold PTSD also appears to be lower among older adults compared with the general population, and that there is evidence that sub-threshold presentations are more common than full PTSD in later life. What the heck is a sub-threshold presentation, which is most popular in society? So like everybody has a sub-threshold presentation, however only 8% of the population has full diagnostic meeting of the criteria. Oh, yeah. Compared with U.S. non-Latino whites, higher rates of PTSD has been reported among U.S. Latinos. Okay, this is ridiculous. They take a tiny marginalized population and then they break down into the pizza slices, right, of that sub-demographic. That's ridiculous. These are exposure and demographic variables we don't need to look at, because it's just taking data and putting it in twisty ways so that people should think scary things are going on in the world. Or the opposite, to destigmatize, a diagnosis. Switching to culture-related diagnostic issues, because when we take an autistic person who is situated within autistic culture, and then we try to get them to disclose things or details of the trauma so that they can be diagnosed with PTSD, why in your right mind would you, a 25-year-old adult, walk into a psychiatrist's office and say, I want to tell you everything that happened when I was in middle school and all the bullying, and then my teacher said I had to go to therapy, and then I found out that therapy was telling me that I'm not allowed to stim and that it's my fault because every time I stim I'm going to be bullied. I want to tell you all about that. I don't know really any autistic person who would approach an assessment in that particular style, okay? It's just not how we roll culturally. So when you're looking at this, they're making a quick, they have 2 paragraphs about the relativity to culture. So again, this is not a culture fair test, right? Because they're not looking at how autistic people seek treatment, how they seek a diagnosis, how they seek intermingling with a non-autistic clinician, right? They may have had prior experience with non-autistic clinicians actually causing them traumatizing experiences. Okay, so culture-related diagnostic issues. They know there are issues. They're required to write about them, so let's read them. The risk of onset and severity of PTSD may differ across cultural groups as a result of variation in the type of traumatic exposure, for example, genocide, the impact on disorder severity of the meaning attributed to the traumatic event, such as inability to perform funerary rites after a mass killing, or the ongoing sociocultural context, for example, residing among unpunished perpetrators in post-conflict settings, and other cultural factors, for example, acculturative stress in immigrants. You know, the stress of being acculturative, meaning I can't assimilate. I'm having a hard time. People are demanding I speak English before I learned how to say yes or no. Those are acculturative stress. I want to go back to give a little bit of an example of the culture-related issues that I have. I am a cultural immigrant. By virtue of being born autistic, I'm a cultural immigrant. I'm a cultural immigrant because I was born in New York City and raised by Holocaust survivors. I did not learn to speak English until 8 years ago. I did not grow up with a television, movies, radio. So for me, I didn't go to public school. I didn't have the experience of American childhood. We didn't celebrate national holidays, legal holidays. So I never, had the experience of Uncle Bob throws the beer cans at the July 4 barbecue. I didn't have any of that. Not that I missed out, but it took me until I was 38 to learn that there was a difference between Star Wars and Star Trek, and I better know the difference because my newly acquired cultural peers, my autistic friends, demanded that I be culturally appropriate when I hang out with them or communicate with my group. So going back to this particular description, the way that PTSD, it specifically says, the onset and severity of PTSD may differ across cultural groups as a result of variation in the type of traumatic exposure. So what is genocide? We know what genocide looks like in the autistic culture. We know that autistic people are being killed because they're too weird and no one knows how to metabolize them. That's genocide. The impact on the disorder severity of the meaning attributed to the traumatic event. So if my culture means that the impact of the meaning of the event is more intense than someone who's not in my culture. So for example, they give inability to perform funerary rites after a mass killing. So I come from ultra-Orthodox Hasidic group of people, a type of Jews that mainly live in the New York tri-state area. And the belief system is that we have to bury within the same day. You all know that people with tattoos are usually not allowed into Orthodox burial plots. It was, 10 years ago that gay people were not allowed to be buried in burial plots. And these are very extreme practices designed to terrify people into following, religious rules. And in the culture I come from, if there is a funeral, men and women sit in different sides of the room. There's a barrier between the sexes. So I have several friends who left Orthodoxy, who then took their lives. And their friends who also left Orthodoxy were not allowed into the funeral. They were not allowed into the burial grounds. So 4 weeks later, 5 weeks later, after the death, they were able to do a little social media invite for the people, and they went there and they did, what she wanted really for her afterlife and not what her family chose. So what her family did was create a extra layer of meaning to the inability to perform some funerary rites because of their sociocultural context. So We're looking at other cultural factors like immigrants who can't enculturate, right? They are being forced to speak the language, English or go home, or profiling people on the street, go back to your country. We all came from another country. So what if my cultural background creates these stressors that other people who are already within the cultural context of the generalized population? This DSM talks about the normal people. It talks about the assumption that you are white, that your family has been living here for 7 generations, you could trace your lineage to the Mayflower. That's who they're talking about. That's why I call them the white man of the Church of Psychiatry. Actually, I prepared my hat because every time I want to bash the white men of the Church of Psychiatry, I'm just going to wear a little fedora. So, yes, what we want to look at is the last paragraph of the culture-related diagnostic issue. Cultural syndromes and idioms of distress influence the expression of PTSD and the range of comorbid disorders in different cultures by providing behavioral and cognitive templates that link traumatic exposures to specific symptoms. What the heck is that? So, for example, panic attack symptoms may be salient in PTSD among Cambodians and Latin Americans because of the association of traumatic exposure with panic-like Kial attacks. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to pretend. And also ataque de nervios. Okay, so in my culture, Jewish, back at it. Yes, ideally, Talia, I am a man. Marty, thank you for loving my chats. I love myself, but when others love my chats, it's like double love. It's so much fun. So I'm thinking about my culture again. Meshuggah, right? You've heard the Jewish word meshuggah. You've heard chutzpah. As a child, all of the time, yes, exactly. I think you load them in Word and they get filled in with stereotype. Precisely. As a child, when I asserted myself, I'll be damned, I was going to be creative with that science project, whether they asked for creativity or not. They called me mechutzef, right? The one with chutzpah. So it wasn't creativity. It wasn't called expressive arts. It wasn't any of that. It was just me trying to individuate, and instead of being recognized for individuation, I was stereotyped as someone who engages in chutzpah. Another word I'm getting at is because it says ataque de nervios, right, which is a Latin American term, and that is very culturally specific. If you have a narrative about where you've been called as someone who's been attacked by the nerves, right? Please share it. In my culture, I was called the Meshuggah. Why have to be so Meshuggah all the time? A Meshuggah literally means loony bin, okay? So I was called crazy in my cultural word in a way that is an irredeemable flag. When 100 years ago in Europe, women were having, anxiety, stress, depression, postpartum depression, stuff like that. What did the scientists call them? What did the white man say? He said hysteria. And what did they do? Let's lock them up for the rest of their lives. How many of my friends can tell me that they've never known their grandmother because she lived the rest of her life in a mental institution? Okay, that's cultural. And when the DSM doesn't take into account that we have a prior history of autistic people being called the R word, you all know that in 2017, Kaiser Hospital wrote in my medical records, mental retardation, okay? If you Google Henny Kupferstein mental retardation, the story will come up. Or mental retardation, or Henny Kupferstein Kaiser, K-A-I-S-E-R. Am I having trouble recalling the details of the event? Yes. That's an example of a cultural formulation that means that the culture-related diagnostic issues must be explicated. Okay, we're looking at a 2-sentence discussion of suicide risk. I'll take it off because I don't know if the white man of the Church of Psychiatry had anything bad to say or if they put this in because it was required by the publisher. Suicide risk is the heading. Traumatic events such as childhood abuse increase a person's suicide risk. PTSD is associated with suicidal ideation and suicide attempts, and presence of the disorder may indicate which individuals with ideation eventually make a suicide plan or actually attempt suicide. I will give you examples, but if you know what that means, and if you can tell me why, they only put 2 sentences in about this. 2 sentences, when this is really a marker for evaluating somebody. If somebody is experiencing ideation, they should be evaluated to meet the criteria, or not. But since they put it as a little footnote, it's just a foot fungus at this point. I'm going to read it again, and then we'll break it down. Traumatic events such as childhood abuse increase a person's suicide risk. So, childhood abuse, more likely to be at risk for suicide. Okay, so you grew up and your mommy and daddy were always fighting and somebody was always throwing things, and then finally they separated when you were 4, but you maintain that in your unconscious mind. Those memories are there forever, whether you can recall them or not. And then you're 14 and suddenly you have suicide issues and you're experiencing suicidality, and nobody is recognizing that this is coming from childhood abuse. However, they specifically say that there's an increased risk. Next sentence, PTSD is associated with ideation and attempt, and that the presence of the disorder may indicate whether somebody has an ideation or attempt. PTSD can indicate, just having a PTSD diagnosis is an indicator that individuals with ideation will eventually make a plan or attempt. So PTSD and suicidality is a greater indication, greater likelihood. Someone who's experiencing suicidality but doesn't have PTSD may or may not have the likelihood of, continuing that in the terms that they use, like attempts, okay? But with PTSD and suicidality, it's almost a guarantee that it will result in an actual attempt, it says, or a plan. All right, we're moving beyond that for a moment because we want to look at the functional consequences of PTSD. What are the consequences in my functioning of PTSD? This is beyond diagnosing, right? PTSD is associated with high levels of social, occupational, and physical disability, as well as considerable economic costs and high level of medical utilization. Impaired functioning is exhibited across social, interpersonal, developmental, educational, physical health, and occupational domains. So, what is an educational domain? How is impaired functioning visible in a child with PTSD who is not making progress, who has impaired disability in educational domains? Okay, last year he was doing fine. This year he has to be put into special education. What happens to the 7th grader who's suddenly downgraded? What happens to the 4th grader who's no longer meeting the IEP goals from last year? Those are functional consequences of PTSD. And that's the bottom of 278, and it's 2 sentences and then finishes on 279. So the last sentence says that in community and veteran samples, right now they're talking about people who were military vets, PTSD is associated with poor social and family relationships, absenteeism from work, lower income, and lower educational and occupational success. If you're a veteran and you were diagnosed with PTSD, you're going to be the flake. You're not going to show up for work. You'll only be involved with low income. I want to put my white man hat back on again, okay? Because what they're not recognizing here is that autistic people are disadvantaged from meeting these domains without having the privilege of PTSD. They don't have the opportunities for greater income, for higher educational success, occupational success. Remember the example of the guy who had to decide whether he should disclose at the interview, and then it cost him his job. So if you're looking at veteran samples, what's important is, luckily, in community and veteran, which means that they're looking at a community as a whole. Samples of community prototypes. We are a community. Autistic people are a type. We are a community of people where PTSD is associated with what? Let's look back. Same thing the veteran is experiencing, autistic community is experiencing. Poor social and family relationships, absenteeism from work, lower income, and lower educational and occupational success. And what do they call us? We're going to go to the last paragraph because it's talking about comorbidity. Comorbidity is something that isn't the death that occurs because of PTSD. Comorbidity is a condition that occurs at the same time as PTSD. So they're going to mainly be talking statistically about the likelihood. So individuals, like for example, people say, oh, every autistic friend that I have has issues with GI. Every autistic person I met has sensory issues, right? So those are comorbidities. We're looking at comorbidity for PTSD, the middle of page 280. Individuals with PTSD are 80% more likely than those without PTSD to have symptoms that meet diagnostic criteria for at least one other mental disorder. So if you have PTSD, there's an 80% chance that you're going to meet a different criteria for a mental disorder, such as depressive, bipolar, anxiety, or substance use disorders. 80%. So as I said earlier, if there's a depression screening that asks if you're having trouble sleeping, it means you should also evaluate for PTSD because of that 80% comorbidity. Comorbid substance use disorder and conduct disorder are more common among males than among females. Okay, why is this interesting? Because we have that 4-to-1 ratio from the CDC. They keep telling us there are 4 times as many autistic boys than there are girls. Yet, I only have autistic female friends, or like 4 male friends who eventually just, my first autistic friend was Tony. Hi, Tony. And he is a male. So I think, anyway, so we're looking at this description that comorbid substance use disorder and conduct disorder is more common in the PTSD boys, not the PTSD girls. So what the heck is a conduct disorder? Is that me walking up and down the street and not stopping at the crosswalk, or not walking at the crosswalk? Is that me insisting on standing behind my cart in the 6 feet apart checkout counter, which means that my wagon is in between the 2 blue dots of 6 feet indicators? What is a conduct disorder? But here they're saying that it's more common in males than females who have PTSD. I'm going to argue, because I think that conduct disorder is more social. It's a social construct. Talia says that it's skewed because they do so much research into PTSD with veterans, and most veterans are men, so therefore they weight it the same as a duck. Yeah, what the clock, right? What the clock. So exactly. What I want to go back here is I want to pause and put this. We'll put the asthma inhaler in here as a bookmark. I want to talk to you man to man. So think about it this way. Before 2013, there were only 2 ways to diagnose PTSD. One was a veteran, a test for military veterans, and the other one was called the civilian version. The civilian version only evaluated PTSD if exposure was extreme violent death. Like if you've injured it, if you were firsthand injured, you got hit by a car, you can be evaluated for PTSD. You saw your child get run over, you can't be evaluated for PTSD. So direct trauma as it occurred to you. When they merged what they did in 2013, the hat really helps, the visual helps to navigate the perspective. Okay, so the perspective I'm taking right now is to talk about expanding the threshold. So this is my light bulb moment, okay? Light bulb moment indicates that when we took Asperger's, we took PDD, NOS, we put all of that together into an autism spectrum disorder. What was the critique that came out? 2013 DSM-5, terrible idea because now we have everybody meeting the criteria. So many more autistic people. And then what did they say? Autism is a pandemic. Okay? For the first time in my life, in 2020, I could not have predicted that I would not be the primary discourse of pandemic language. Thank you, COVID. So, that doesn't mean that COVID is cool and that people should die. It just means that for the first time, I am not the topic of interest by the CDC. I am not causing pandemic, panic-related epidemic discourse about autism is contagious. You get it from something. Let's avoid what it came from. Really? In my case, autism was sexually transmitted. My father gave it to me, and I gave it to my children. Yay! All right, so we know that the DSM-5 expanded the criteria for autism spectrum disorder, and now all of us can meet the criteria as opposed to just being super weird and different. So when people were critiquing it, they said, what is really the truth? More cases or higher prevalence of autism, or expanding the threshold, leveling the playing field? Okay, so nobody was happy. Everyone was angry. But we mainly benefited. If you ask the autistic people, we mainly benefit from the expansion of the criteria. If you ask people overseas, in the United Kingdom, they're still not really happy. They want their Asperger's. All right, keep it, no problem. You have it on the ICD code, but you no longer have it with the DSM codes. Well, let's come back to the veterans. In 2013, one of the major revisions that happened, in addition to the merging of the autism diagnosis, is you get PTSD and you get PTSD. Everybody gets PTSD. Why? Because they added exposure types. They expanded the threshold so that any type of exposure can be potentially traumatizing. So let's look at criteria 8, exposure to a threat or an actual threat, serious injury, or sexual violence. It didn't have to happen to you because you could have directly experienced the event. You could have witnessed it in person as it occurred to others. You could have learned about the event because it has happened to a close family member or a close friend. And 4, you could have experienced repeated or extreme exposure to a detail, an aversive detail of a traumatic event. And for autistic people, I'm going to say the white man has this wrong. Autistic people who learn about other children who are currently being exposed to ABA, which one of these 4 does it meet? Does it meet directly experiencing the event? No. I'm not going to therapy with a child. I don't get to be beaten up by an ABA therapist. I'm not a child anymore. So A1, not happening. A2, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others. Am I taking my 4-year-old child to 40 hours of PTSD and then I have to sit there and witness it? He cries, he screams, he wants to leave. The therapist double locks the door. We're not allowed to leave until the timer goes off. Have I witnessed in person the event as it occurred to another? Yes. Talia says school. So are you talking about the child going to school and you knowing that the child is going through that because they come home and tell you about it? Is that witnessing in person? If you go to school, you're witnessing in person something that has happened to you, and that is directly experiencing, which is A1, directly experiencing the traumatic event. If school was traumatizing to you, you have directly experienced it. A1! Bad joke, Henny. So A3. A3 is learning that the event occurred to a close family member or close friend. Now, if your autistic peer is your friend and your autistic friend had a traumatic event happen to them, and I hear about it in our conversation, I have learned about the traumatic event that occurred to them. And when I learned about it, it was traumatizing to me. So Talia says a traumatic event for children, such as bingo card winning. Yeah, okay, we don't want to be high five Jimmy in class. I don't want to be called out for successes or rewarded and all that. Okay, what we're looking at is for the experience of repeated or extreme exposure to an aversive detail of the traumatic event. Let's bring it into ABA again. So, repeated or extreme exposure. How much is too much when a newly diagnosed child experiences 40 hours a week of intense one-to-one ABA? 4-year-old child, non-speaking autistic 4-year-old child versus grown-ass adult with a 2-day training on ABA treatment. We're looking at people who are being qualified quickly because they don't have enough providers who stick with the job. They don't have enough people who are willing to do any of this. Okay, I'm going to pull up my study from the ABA and the PTSD, the correlation between that. We're not saying that ABA causes PTSD. We're saying that people who are exposed to ABA have a greater likelihood of also meeting the criteria. Problem is, we don't know how to evaluate PTSD in autistic children or non-speaking people because the DSM-5 is missing those pages because Kupferstein 2020 has not written the addendum yet. It's coming out, and I'm going to leave the bloopers for the end. You're going to be excited. So here is the prediction. If you have the access to my study from 2018, it's on my website, hennyk.com. Just go to the articles, media, research page. You'll see it. My 2018 study was evidence of post-traumatic stress symptoms in individuals exposed to applied behavior analysis autism intervention. I think I got that title right from memory. I had to read it from my cognition. So by looking at the prevalence of PTSD and these symptoms in all the people who said that they have been exposed to ABA, I wanted to test in that study if the longer they were exposed to ABA, the more severity, the threshold. Well, it turns out that we were able to have a prediction. Taking this off because I'm not the white man. Visuals, yeah, red flag. The red flag is this. Ooh, here's the real red flag. All right, let's get this out. Okay, red flag, 2018 study. Red flag says that a 18-month-old child who's exposed to 40 hours of ABA a week, they will meet the criteria for PTSD within 6 weeks. A 3-year-old child who's exposed to only 20 hours a week, right? They're 3 now, early intervention. Now we downgrade from 40 hours to 20 hours. We expect that they're potty trained. Now they're suddenly looking at the 3-year-old for 20 hours a week, guaranteed will meet the criteria within 5 months. Saddest part, put your Kleenex up to your face. A 5-year-old child who's reduced to 10 hours a week of ABA will meet the PTSD criteria before his 7th birthday. All right, so that's your red flag for you. Taking it off. What I want to get back to is why this is an inadequate descriptor of our people, our culture. What are they missing with people who cannot be evaluated? And the answer is they're missing diagnostic screenings that can separate these symptoms and say this symptom is not because of alcohol or because another medical condition, right? Nobody in the field of psychiatry has explored the double crossing of symptoms that I'll give you an example. When screening an autistic person for depression, and the diagnostician asks you, so do you spend a lot of time alone? And you're like, hell yeah, best time of my day is when I'm home. I can do my things, my video games, I can play, I don't know, play with my rain stick, right? They're raining on my parade because they're asking me if I'm spending time alone because they're trying to put a checkbox in the isolation box. Isolation is part of autism. We thrive in isolation. Have you not seen my isolation video? Hi, Nikki. Thank you for starring in it. If you go to my page and you look for the pink thumbnail with a lady in curlers, that's my isolation video. It answers the question, why are autistic people thriving in a pandemic? And also subtitle, who is maladaptive now? Isolation. That's the refrain. So enjoy listening to that. Why I'm saying all of this is because I am dedicated in my next study, which has a mystery co-author. Until it's published, I can't reveal too many details. However, I'd like to read to you what the purpose of the study is. This is the abstract. The manifestations of emotional trauma in autistic adults is psychometrically challenging to operationalize when superimposed with autistic culture. Autistic people have experienced traumatic events and subsequently seeking mental health care. Autistic people having experienced traumatic events and subsequently seeking mental health care are disadvantaged due to the paucity of specific standardized clinical tools assessing their mental well-being. Autistic adults were recruited for the study based on a self-report experience with suicide-related stressors in their peers. What is a self-report? Non-autistic people are asked, do you have trouble sleeping? That's a self-report, which means if you check all the right boxes or all the wrong boxes, you can essentially purchase yourself a diagnosis, okay? An autism diagnosis operates the same way. It's a self-report. Hey, do you feel alien when you're with your family, right? That's a self-report. So for this study, autistic adults were recruited based on self-reported experience with suicide-related stressors in their peers. So if you had a peer, an autistic peer who's experienced suicidality, you were participating in this study if you chose to be included. Then the analyzed narratives was scored per the DSM-5 for a traumatic stressor and to qualify the exposure criteria for PTSD. Okay, we were looking to see if autistic people can demonstrate exposure using a self-report. Our findings indicate that autistics who are exposed to suicidality in autistic peers are primarily concerned with how something, something, something. We're going to basically leave that hanging. You'll have to read the study when it comes out. Given the significant correlation between, basically he found some significant stuff about coping mechanisms, how autistic people can somehow not get the diagnosis of PTSD because part of our culture is coping. Part of our culture is supporting each other. Part of our neurology being dropped into this alien world and just being forced to live here requires that we have to adapt constantly. The 3-year-old child has to adapt to the demand of the ABA therapist. The 2-year-old child has to adapt to the demands of the mom who says, no more pull-ups, we go potty now. Because we have been adapting to these demands for our whole lives, we are also adapting to the stressors of PTSD. And that's why we can't be diagnosed until Kupferstein comes in along and we make these assessments. So the purpose of the study was to see if autistic people, speaking or otherwise, can provide a self-report so that they can be evaluated on whether they've been exposed to a traumatic stressor. Once we demonstrate the exposure criteria, I will keep going down and I will compare what the non-autistic people are being tested for. And I'm sorry, I got to take a puff because I've been talking for too long. Please work. Okay, so punchline of the study is we need to start somewhere. We need to have a screening instrument that can help autistic people answer these questions. And it has to be adaptive. It has to be accommodating of all different types of communications. And most importantly, where I come in as the psychologist, we need to be able to collect the self-report from people who have fragmented recall of a traumatic event. because otherwise, you know, otherwise they become at risk of being labeled as intellectually disabled, which isn't the truth. It's just a, alteration in cognition, alteration in mood. This is part of PTSD. If you're having trouble recalling the event, if it's triggering to type and talk about it, if it's triggering to draw about it, okay? So I'm not going to say much more except that one of the ways that the assessment evaluated exposure was we allowed people to upload a file attachment to describe in nonverbal ways their experience. And we had two types of people who were two types mainly of uploads. Those who were quite literally taking photographs of firearms and uploading that, and imagine being the researcher and looking through the data and I see like 10 pictures of guns. And then there were the other group who were very abstract, memes, poetry. It was a fabulous study to conduct. We started it about 5 months ago. I have an autistic co-author. We are going to do this. With your continued support, we're going to continue to publish research. I don't take money from government because I can't meet their agenda. I don't want to join the white man church of psychiatry. I don't want to be the person who makes culturally making statements that are culturally ignorant. I don't want to be the person who doesn't take into account that people communicate differently, especially when they have a traumatizing memory of an encounter. And what's still missing in here is, believe it or not, this DSM does not have a diagnostic criteria for complex PTSD, for people who have been traumatized repeatedly and repeatedly. It just doesn't exist in the lexicon of diagnostics yet, because they just don't know what to do with us. They don't know what to do with the autistic child who has to have 40 hours a week for like 18 years of his life. How do you begin to evaluate that? Take off this hat. I'm not the white man of the Church of Psychiatry. I'm Henny Kupferstein. No, it's not short for Henrietta. And you know where to find me. Just go to hennyk.com, look at all the resources, spend 14 hours every single night staying awake, looking at my videos and whatever, anything, okay? Whatever makes you happy, but know that we're on your side. Know that if you have any suggestion for research, for anything you're curious about, shoot me a message, put me in the comments. So yes, Krista was about to mention CPTSD. C-PTSD is something that people who have been chronically exposed to traumatizing experiences, they have started attaching themselves to this type of identity, but it's not an actual diagnosis yet. And that means it complicates the procedures for receiving treatment and care in the first place. Not being able to be diagnosed means you can't bill insurance for 30981, right? If you can't be diagnosed and they can't put this code down, then the therapist can't treat you. If you go to the therapist and they can't diagnose you with PTSD, the only way they can justify repeat sessions is if they make some other fake thing like depression and anxiety. Tali says it would be interesting to know how many autistic people who were undiagnosed in elementary school have PTSD or even CPTSD from school. So this would be a continuum study. Keep in mind that one criteria F, I think it was, it said that the duration of the disturbance had to last more than 1 month. There is a foot fungus note that I didn't talk about, which is that one of the things that most clinicians know is that you can't evaluate for PTSD before 30 days after the event. So if I wanted to evaluate a child who went to school for PTSD, I would have to wait for them to disclose. I would have to wait for 30 days. Then I would have to look for all these alterations and see which criteria they meet. Oh, stopped sleeping, 1 month after they were not picked prom queen, right? Whatever. And so there are these limitations that clinicians have that pertain to timeline. However, you can have PTSD in adulthood from something that happened in childhood. And remember, we were looking at the likelihood. Children who are exposed to child abuse have an increased risk of suicidality in adulthood together with PTSD. So yes, when we see these markers in adults, we always have to come back to the original source and what was the primary encounter. And when we evaluate for the exposure type, for criteria A, we have to learn about the details to see if it meets the criteria. So if a child comes to me and says, hey, you know, in the 4th grade, someone called me the R word, someone called me carrot top, someone called me shorty, you know, stuff like that. And then they never wanted to go to gym because their legs were poking out from the gym shorts. And then after that, for the next 3 years, their grades are failing, their social life has decreased. All of that, really pretty good indicators that we can start doing a PTSD assessment. Yes, Marty says, thank you. Mardi, I'm sorry. Finally, someone with sensibility. May autistic voices be heard? Autistic voices can be heard by people who recognize us to have a right for inclusion because we exist. And I think that autistic voices should be heard before other marginalized populations at this time, because communication is part of communication impairments is part of an autism diagnosis, which means we need extra attention to the way we communicate, because we're not going to communicate like other populations, and we're not going to go marching in a parade for the same cause. We're going to remain in isolation. So if there's one little blobby head talking, people should listen. Krista says that it kind of seems like the DSM has no way of accounting for trauma from childhood, chronic childhood abuse, or whatever form it comes in from, which seems like a ridiculous oversight. Well, the ridiculous oversights we're talking about is the white man, right, of the Church of Psychiatry. For example, when we talked about culture-related diagnostic issues, why the heck is it on page 278 when the criteria begins on 271? We're making, what, 7 pages? The clinician has to wait 7 pages to say, oh shit, right, but if my client is from Vietnam and they are coming to me without, you know, their arms because it was hacked off when they were a child soldier or something like that, I have to go 7 pages in and say, is it a cultural factor? And then, for example, a culture rate of stress in an immigrant. He comes to America and everyone wants to know what happened to his arms. So he has to explain it over and over and over and over again. And what do you think? It happened when his arms got hacked off was the only trauma that's happened to him? Or that was one of the many? Obviously, there is no way to look at ongoing abuse for children, but that's why we know that children who have, domestic violence is linked to learning disabilities. Child abuse is linked to ADHD. So kids who are struggling, who have all these alterations, we need to see which criteria they meet, because if it's ongoing, it will be so severe that it will cause multiple alterations. And what did they say? That there was 80% chance that someone with PTSD also has a different mental disorder from this Bible. Okay, so in the tradition of chewing this to pieces, I will now chew it for your satisfaction, trigger my TMJ. Ah! Give out your rage, people. Give it out. Show them how you can have a conduct disorder while maintaining a professional presence. So with that, we conclude. Thank you for participating. I will be talking next about a surprise page in the in the DSM. If you're a wise ass and you want to guess, you can do so. However, I'm gonna give you the clue. It's page 663, and it won't stop there because I'm gonna go to immediately following a couple of pages later, 667. So 4 pages from 663 plus 667 because these two are cousins. And that's going to be a fabulous expose. You're welcome to join. Cupcake pajamas optional. And please follow because I have things to say. And if there's one autistic bobblehead, let's listen. It's worth it. I'm going to end the video. Have a fun weekend. Do something in isolation and celebrate your autisticness. Whee!